Hi, this is Julie, and I'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode, but I wanted to bring this Encore conversation with Mothers Against Police Brutality's Sara Mokuria in a week where so many of us have been grappling with the issue of police violence and what we can do about it. This week, our consciousness has been focused on the tragic deaths of two Black people, Botham Jean and Atiana Jefferson, who were murdered in their own homes by police officers. Botham was in his own apartment when an off-duty police officer shot and killed him, allegedly mistaking him for an intruder in her own apartment. Recently, the woman who killed him was sentenced to only 10 years in prison for his death. Atiana Jefferson, who was playing video games with her nephew in her own home at the time, was murdered when an officer sent to the house by a neighbor because of an open door immediately shot and killed Atiana instead of checking on her well-being. I know many of us have been searching for some action we can take about this issue, and I want to encourage you to do two things. First, listen to this conversation with Sara Mokuria, one of the co-founders of Mothers Against Police Brutality. She will give you insight and advocacy steps from her own experience losing her father. And then make a donation to Mothers Against Police Brutality, an organization that is seeking change by addressing policy and building police accountability, beginning in Texas, but with nationwide impact. Inspired by my last conversation with trust-based philanthropy thought leader Pia Infante, our family committed this week to an ongoing monthly donation to support Mothers Against Police Brutality over time, and made the donation in honor of two men who lost their lives to police violence over the last year in my own area, Chinedu Akobi and Miles Hall. As you listen, I hope you'll consider making a donation as well. And I also challenge you to identify just one person who you can share this episode and this call to action with. Together, we can start to take steps in the direction of police accountability. Now, here's my conversation again with Sara Mokuria. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neal, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to two high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? In the months leading up to a big milestone birthday, I decided it was time to stop sidelining my dreams and realize that I'm the hero of my own journey. I knew I didn't want to do it alone, so I created this podcast to learn from other moms on their own quest, so their words of wisdom and lessons learned could help light the way for mine. I created this podcast for myself. Come along with me, and you'll find some treasures of your own. Hello, and welcome to this important episode, number 33 of the Mother's Quest podcast, with Sara Mokuria, co-founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality. It's the third and final in a series I recorded as part of the Women Podcasters in Solidarity initiative, and it comes to you with a call to action to get involved with this issue today. Before I share more about this episode, I want to introduce Colette Flanagan, the founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, with this episode's dedication.
Hello, my name is Colette Flanagan. I'm the founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality. I founded Mothers Against Police Brutality after my only son, Clinton Allen, was shot and killed by Dallas policemen on March the 10th of 2013. Clinton was unarmed, 25 years old, and a lifetime ahead of him. I managed to turn my grief into fuel and decided that as much as I loved and adored my only son, Clinton, this problem of police killing our children and given immunity by the judicial system was much bigger than just one child. I am honored today to dedicate this episode to all mothers who have lost children to police brutality. Our children's lives who are stolen through police brutality are lost to us forever. Their lives were not a moment that was taken from us, but it was a lifetime stolen from mothers, fathers, their children, our families, and it changes our communities forever. I encourage you to have the courage to say their names and to know their names. They are our children. An insult to one mother is an insult to all mothers. Have the courage to fight against police brutality. Thank you.
Thank you, Colette, for sharing this dedication with us, for your courage in turning your grief over the loss of your son, Clinton Allen, into fuel for change, and for reminding us of our common humanity as mothers. It's this truth you shared, Colette, that an insult to one mother is an insult to all mothers, that caused me to record this series of episodes after I saw the heartbreaking video of Diamond Reynolds and her then 4-year-old daughter after they witnessed the killing of Philando Castile. Philando was like a father to this little girl, was unarmed, and was complying with the police officer's requests when he was shot. Seeing the trauma and heartbreak endured by this 4-year-old girl, who was the same age as my son when I saw this video, became a catalyst for me to face the epidemic of police brutality in our country and to begin taking action, however imperfect. My guest on the podcast today, Sara, also endured the trauma and heartbreak of watching her father killed by police at her home in Dallas when she was 10 years old. Fueled by her own experience, Sara joined Colette, along with another co-founder, John Fullenwider, in creating Mothers Against Police Brutality as a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition uniting mothers nationwide to fight for civil rights, police accountability, and policy reform. Sara is a mom herself to a 7-year-old boy. And in addition to her work with Mothers Against Police Brutality, she's a sought-after educator, community organizer, project manager, and facilitator, currently working as Associate Director for Leadership Initiatives with the Institute for Urban Policy Research at the University of Texas at Dallas. She has 2 master's degrees, has taught both high school and college at the University of Texas at Dallas, and currently serves on the International Mechanism Coordinating Committee for the U.S. Human Rights Network. She came to the conversation with an open heart, she told me, and I felt her generosity and honesty throughout as she shared how police violence changed her life forever, discussed the trauma of being Black in America, how the institution of policing and the prison industrial complex contributes to that trauma, and the ways in which an investment in Mothers Against Police Brutality can change policies and systems to reduce violence and create more accountability. As compelling was Sara's exploration of the vision she has for our future, of vibrant communities where we invest in our young people, lean into and value our differences, and where each of us taps into our own unique magic to get us there. We ended our conversation with a co-created prayer, a wish for myself as much as for all of you listening, to move into greater responsibility for this work from wherever we are, to have the courage to go to those difficult and painful places so we can create a freer future, and to take this moment right now to support this cause. I'm doing that today by making a financial contribution to Mothers Against Police Brutality and putting my resources with the mothers who are closest to the problem, mothers like Colette and Sara, who are closest to the problem and who can see the solution. I hope you'll join me. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. Sara, welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast. I'm really honored to have you here for this important conversation.
Thank you. I'm happy to be joining you.
We've talked a little bit behind the scenes about the importance and the focus of this episode. It's different than most of the ones I've done in that it is part of my pledge to an initiative I started this fall called Women Podcasters in Solidarity. And essentially, I wanted to commit to doing some episodes to have courageous conversations about race, to talk about how, especially me as a white woman and other members of my community, can work on anti-racism and raise our awareness. But also, I'm aware that, many of us have a lot of privilege, and there's a responsibility to use that privilege to make a difference. So one of the ways is to direct resources to support advocacy, policy, and organizing work around the movement for Black lives. So I was introduced to you through Nicole Lee, who was the first person I interviewed as part of this initiative. And Nicole has done some work with you and just spoke so highly of your organization, Mothers Against Police Brutality. And I'm looking forward to delving into both your personal story, but also really the work of this organization that you have helped to found and the ways that we could support you. So we'll start with a question that I do ask all of my guests, which is tell me a little bit about your own childhood and the impact that your mother has had on shaping who you are today and the work that you do in the world now.
Well, my childhood, I really see my childhood in two phases. My father was killed by police when I was 10 years old. And so that created a traumatic break in our lives. And from 10 on, I was raised by my mother as a single mother. But I would say my childhood pre 10 years old was very joyous. I had very eclectic childhood in the sense that my family sought out many experiences together through cultural events and festivals, and we spent a lot of time together as a unit, which was really joyous and invaluable. In terms of my mother has been one of the greatest inspirations of my life in the sense that she's always modeled for me a way to be expansive and to not have limits. She's always encouraged me to be my fullest self and to believe that I can achieve anything. She's been an advocate for me. And just through the way she's chosen to live her life, she's modeled for me a way to navigate the world. I would say after my father died, there was a break between us and we had a more tumultuous relationship. But even in the midst of our hardest times, she always showed me unconditional love. She always advocated for me. So even in our hard times, she has been a constant and a rock in my life.
You mentioned, what happened with your father at the age of 10, and I know that that experience, obviously changed everything for you. It also, it seems that it has set you on a mission in your life. What's important for us to know about the impact of what happened with your father, and what are you most on a quest for now?
Well, I would say first, Julie, you're not able to fathom the level of pain. I don't think anybody can. And I know now, especially with the videos and with the hashtags, there's this pain that we all feel just as humans and trying to grasp the pain that police brutality wreaks into one's life. But it's really unfathomable in the sense that it is a trauma that lives with you for your entire life. It appears in different ways at different forms, and there are multiple levels of trauma. There's the level of losing your loved one, just the mortality aspect of it. But then there is the trauma of dealing with institutions that we're all taught are semblance of justice within society, which don't operate in just ways. And so you're re-traumatized by legal mechanisms. So the way that the police department treats you, the way the district attorney's office treats you, the way that the courts fail to recognize the humanity of your loved one and you, the way you're treated by the media, the way that your family relationships and friendships change, every aspect of your life becomes broken. And so it's a pain and a trauma like no other. And it's not something I would wish upon anyone. It's not something that anyone should ever experience. I think it's a crime against humanity. And so I would say it didn't set a mission for my life, but the level of pain and trauma that it created in my life inspired me to fight so that others would never have to experience such a thing.
So I find myself in this moment with a tremendous amount of reverence for what you just shared. And also that knowing that I have, just as you said, like I can't even imagine, that there are ways that we can get closer to glimpsing in. And I know that you listened to a conversation I had with a friend of mine, Genji Heiston, which set me on this path of wanting to do more of this work, where she shared this very emotional Facebook Live after the death of another man at the hands of a police officer, saying, to her white friends, I want you to feel, I want you to imagine, I want you to know what this feels like to literally fear for the safety of your Black husband, your Black sons, your Black brothers every day when they walk out the door. And the truth is that I can't know that, just as you said. I'm curious what it is that those of us who don't have any idea of the trauma that you and so many other people have gone through, what would you want us to do to be able to educate ourselves or honor, the crimes against humanity that have happened?
Well, I would say the trauma and the pain that your friend was speaking to is the trauma of being Black in America. And that is created by the upholding and the reinforcement of white supremacy. And so there is a trauma in knowing that your ability to navigate and live within this world and within the system is very fragile, regardless of your socioeconomic status or geography. That's part of being Black in this country and in this world. And I think that what your friend was calling for was for white folks to open their eyes, their hearts and minds to sympathize with that feeling, but then also I would take it a step further to actively work to dismantle that. It's markedly different when it does happen to you. And even for me, I lost my father, and I cannot fathom what the founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, Colette Flanagan, lives with every day and losing her child. I'm a mother, I have a 7-year-old, and I know the grief and the pain of watching 2 officers kill my father. And I still cannot imagine what it would be like to lose my son to police. And so I think that there are aspects of this issue that are tangible in the sense that we all have people that we love in this world. And recognizing and understanding that every day, on average, 3 people are killed by law enforcement in this country, every single day. In 2017, there have only been 10 days where an officer did not kill somebody. And so if you've ever loved someone, those numbers are very tangible, and we can all imagine what it would feel like to lose those people. So that's one aspect. Another aspect that is tangible is if you've ever had any type of injustice done to you, big or small, you can sympathize with that feeling and then imagine it being multiplied in terms of that being the police department and the district attorney's office. Because when somebody's murdered, one individual kills another individual, the way that that story plays out is trying to understand the context of what happened and determining the guilt or the innocence of the person who committed the murder. But when it happens to someone, when a police officer is the perpetrator, we get into this language of justified and unjustified. And we use that with murder as well, but not in the same way. And your whole life is played out in the media of trying to sanction this state violence. So saying, well, they had a prior criminal record, or they used drugs at some point, or any number of things as a justification for killing someone. I think another tangible thing is we've all had a bad day. We've all had the worst moment in our lives. And maybe that played out in public, maybe that didn't. I think we're all in a relationship with our mental health, and some of us have resources and are able to manage it better than others. And so when these things play out in the public and then are used as justification for you no longer existing, for taking your life, to me, it's incomprehensible.
So tell me about, the way in which you and your founders and Colette, who lost her son in such a tragic way, what are the ways in which Mothers Against Police Brutality is trying to impact everything that you just described?
What Mothers Against Police Brutality works towards is transforming police departments and district attorney offices through policy reform. So we believe that you can create policies and practices that protect the sanctity of life. And it's something that we believe we should all require of our police departments. Most don't know, for example, that in Dallas, when Clinton Allen, Colette's son, was killed, he was shot 7 times, the last shot being at close range.
Wow.
He was unarmed, and this officer was back on the street days later, before an investigation was complete. And this is a standard practice around the country. Now, imagine if one of our children were in a classroom and a teacher was accused of sexual misconduct and was in the classroom even while an investigation was open.
Right.
There's no way. That's not fathomable. But police officers, law enforcement agents, can kill someone and be on the street days later giving out traffic tickets. I mean, even beyond whether it was justified or not, there is trauma that comes in that situation, and this person is traumatized in their own right, and yet they're back on the street days later.
Yeah.
So that's one simple policy change that we've advocated for here in Dallas, Texas, and also nationally. Another policy point that a lot of people are not aware of is most states have something called crime victims compensation, which is a fund that is created so that when you are a victim of a crime, that you are able to tap into resources like counseling, if there was a death involved, funeral services, and any monetary assistance that comes in terms of loss of wages or loss of property or damages to property. In Texas, victims of police encounters, police brutality, are the only class of victims outside of that circle of support. So, for example, in my own personal story, my mother, myself as a 10-year-old, and my baby sister, who was 1 at the time, witnessed 2 officers shooting and killing my father. And my mother had to fight for 2 years for us to even be considered crime victims eligible for counseling services.
Wow. That's unfathomable.
So these are the types of policies that exist across our nation that we, Mothers Against Police Brutality, are fighting to change. We also believe that the roles that police play in our communities need to change. The amount of leverage that they have has widened, and the role that they play in our communities has deepened to a point where it's insidious. There was a recent article that reported the amount of money police departments are spending on portable cell towers so that they can do surveillance within certain neighborhoods, which picks up on all of our cell phone activity. And the militarization of our police departments that we've seen, especially after Ferguson and here in Dallas, where police departments have bomb-throwing robots and military equipment and tanks. And so we believe that that is not the role that police should be playing in our communities. And so we have to divest from this militarization of our police and invest in our communities in the form of education, in the form of mental health services, in the form of job training. And so we need to radically rethink the way our local budgets are being spent, because you're hard-pressed to find a community that doesn't spend a third of their budget on policing.
Yeah.
And is that the best use of our resources? In Dallas County, our sheriff's department spends well over $11 million a month on the sheriff's department. And that includes our county jail. So that's incarcerating people, that is arresting people, that's ticketing people, that's the sheriff's department policing budget. And is there a better way that we could spend $11 million a month? Would our communities look radically different if we invested that money in the folks that live in our community?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to really appreciate the backdrop that you just shared, this whole picture of where the resources are spent, the militarization of police, and where your organization is seeing, how to make the biggest difference through policy reform. And I want this conversation today to really shine a light on investment, where any of us who choose to support this work and step into this advocacy and supporting your organization in particular on Giving Tuesday, which is the day that this conversation will be released, want to look at the different ways in which we could shift the way that we think, the way that we invest, and the way that we all take some action. When I created Mother's Quest, I identified that I want to live what I call an epic life, where I look back and realize that I really pursued the things that matter most. And EPIC is also an acronym mnemonic for the guideposts that I think help us live that life when we're raising our children. For the purposes of this conversation, I want to take each of those guideposts and really look at how they can help us see another angle of investment. So the first one, E, stands for engaged mindfully with our children. And you started to talk a little bit about, what it could look like in terms of investing, shifting where the resources go, and really investing in communities, in our young people. Can you share a little bit about what you would like to see and what some of the advocacy stands are that you take? And also, if there's anything that you want to talk about in terms of your own experience as a mother, in terms of how you're wanting to invest in your son related to this conversation.
Well, so I think the first point, which you spoke to, is really delving into understanding the way your local community works in terms of requesting and demanding, more than requesting, transparency and accountability from your local government. So looking at the budget and understanding how much of the money is being spent in public safety, but then also reframing what public safety means. Because for most folks of color, at least, when you ask what makes you feel safe, police are not on that list. It's family, it's being in community, it's maybe being in a cultural institution or having a home, a safe place to be. Those are the things that make myself and a lot of folks that I've talked to feel safe. And so why is the money that we spend on public safety not invested into the things that make us feel safe, that make our families feel more whole? We should be advocating for that. Number two is learning about what your police department is doing. I think that there are certain phrases that we've all been trained to hear and just accept. For example, when a police officer says, "I feared for my life," that's an automatic justification for whatever activity they used after they feared for their life. The officer who killed Colette's son, Clinton Allen, used that phrase. And she often asked, "When did you stop fearing for your life? After your first shot, your second, your third, your fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh?" So the leeway that we give law enforcement is something that needs to shift and change. The other piece is the war on drugs, which is really played out as a war on people of color. We know, statistically speaking, that every race uses drugs. There is not one race that uses drugs more than any other. And just because of the demographics right now, there are more white drug users in America than there are anybody else because there are more white people. But when you look at who is incarcerated for drugs, it is overwhelmingly Black and brown folks. And so we have allowed drugs to be used as justification for killing and incarcerating Black and brown people. And also systematically cutting Black and brown people out of the job market, out of the ability to receive aid, and in some cases, taking away the ability to vote and participate as a full citizen.
Yes. Have you seen the movie 13th?
Yes. And I think that's a really great film that highlights some of the issue that I'm addressing. Another really great resource is the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So if these are new concepts to you or your listeners are interested in learning more and understanding this issue in a more in-depth way, I suggest reading The New Jim Crow or watching the documentary 13th. And there are tons of resources that exist. Drug Policy Alliance is a national organization, which is another place that articulate how and why we need to end the war on drugs really well.
Yeah. I think everything that you're saying, the reason why I asked about the movie 13th is I watched it as well. And, it is really shocking and alarming about how the whole system has been set up, target and incarcerate Black men, and how that, was systematically begun as soon as slavery was abolished. So definitely I'll include links to these resources that you mentioned in the show notes. How about in thinking about educating our young people? So one, I know at least for me with my own children, and this is something that Nicole Lee was really helpful about, is starting to have conversations about race and looking at these things in a developmentally appropriate way from the time our children are young. What has the experience been like for you as you're raising your own Black son with all of this as a backdrop?
Well, my son is very aware of the work that I do, and it is his loss as well. There have been nights that I never even fathomed that this would be an issue, but when my son gets really tired, he sometimes, he'll cry for my mom's dog who died a couple of years ago. He'll cry for his family members that he misses, and he cries for my father, Tesfai Mokuria, his grandfather that he never knew. And how do I console him for the loss of never having a grandfather? He acutely feels the pain and the loss of not having a grandfather and not having that relationship. And that's something as a mother, in all the work that I do, I never even thought of that aspect of it.
Yeah.
And so that generational pain and trauma. But I think for me, what's important with him is helping him understand and have a framework of understanding and making sense of the injustices that exist in this world. And also, in all of that, encouraging and reinforcing tenderness and love and joy as acts of resistance and creating a foundation of resiliency within him. What we are living through and the pains and the joys that we have, there are so many people who have survived and thrived before us that have lived much harder stories and survived so that we could be here. And so that's something that I ground him in. But I think raising white children, one thing that's important is teaching them how dangerous of a concept whiteness is. Because it's not about skin color. It's not about being, the color white. It's not even about race. It's about the willful blindness of reinforcing and justifying white supremacy. And turning a blind eye to racism, to mass incarceration, to the structural inequalities that exist in our world. That right now, for a Black family to have the same level of wealth of a white family would take 280 plus years to catch up, just to be on an equal footing financially. And so it's very important, I think, for white parents to teach their children that you are no more deserving than the next child of having this, that this did not come from your beauty and your brilliance and your amazingness, as if everyone else in this world does not share that same beauty and brilliance and amazingness, that there are structural inequalities that created this. And that's not to teach shame, but that's to teach responsibility. So recognizing that we're not all on equal footing, how do you use whatever positions of power and space that you have to open the doors, to break down barriers, to break down fences, to break down doors, so that there can be more space for everyone?
Yes.
It's especially hard in the way that we have set our society up, in the United States right now. This idea that we have a meritocracy, right? Like that somehow, just based on your merit, you got this scholarship or you achieved this accomplishment, as if there are no structures of bias that exist that made it harder or easier for you to get to whatever point you're in. And so I think having all of our children understand and hold a responsibility to changing those dynamics is fundamentally important.
Yes. Well, I'm committed to doing this with my children, and I will also include the link in the show notes to my conversation with Nicole Lee, because she's just an incredible resource for teaching those of us who haven't done this before how to begin to have these kinds of conversations with our children. Thank you for everything that you shared. And I think, as I've been delving into this work of anti-racism, that a lot of the internal work, first of all, the realization that talking about whiteness as a construct and white supremacy as a construct that is, so damaging really to the fabric of all of our democracy and freedom. It's not racism against people who are white, which I think is often, a defensive stance that white people will hear when there is this conversation about whiteness. That's one realization. The other is that being in a place of shame or guilt is not helpful. and that we really do need to shift into a place of responsibility, into taking action, and into using our privilege.
Absolutely. And I think, the easiest, most concrete way to start this work is to reading history and just really delving into a real understanding of history and having those conversations with our children as well. We cannot depend on schools to teach our children world history or U.S. history, because so often everyone is left out of that, and even white women, right? Like the contributions that white women have made in this world. You don't learn about indigenous history, Latinx history, Black history, women's rights. You don't learn about any of these things. You don't learn about intersectionality in history class in high school or middle school. And so we have to teach our children these things in creative ways. There are so many, thankfully now, children's books. There are historical sites all across the country and the world that we can take our children to and have these conversations. And I think it's a matter of learning and understanding it. I think it was important when you said it's not an attack on white people, and it's in the learning and understanding of how did people become white? What is the history of whiteness? There's a really great book called How the Irish Became White. And it really talks about that process of when Irish people came to the United States, there was immense racism and prejudice put upon them. So many ways that they were kept out of participating fully within society. And so really tracing and understanding how did the Irish move from that point to becoming fully accepted into whiteness. And I think that's true for every ethnicity, right? How did the Italian become white? How did the Jewish become white? How did, every ethnic group buy into the larger structure of white supremacy? And we see some of that shifting now in terms of when we look at demographics around Latinx. When you look at any form, it says Hispanic, non-Black, right? So there is this distinction that you are not Black, right? And so I think we will see in the next 10 to 20 years changes in the way that some groups of Latinx folks are treated in terms of trying to continue and maintain white supremacy.
Wow. That's fascinating. I had never thought about that on the demographic forms. Whew, it's a powerful force.
It is, but we as people are more powerful, right? I think that's the thing that excites me, is that we are endlessly creative people. And so as difficult as it is to fathom all of this devastation and horror and tragedy no longer existing, as hard as it is for me to fathom that, I always think about all the things that exist in our daily lives today that didn't exist when I was a child, that we would not be able to fathom, like even simple things like GPS,
right,
or cell phones. And, there are all kinds of things that have radically changed society. And I believe that it is possible for us to move beyond this moment.
Well, I want to use that as a segue into the next two guideposts. P, passionate and purposeful, is about the work that we do in the world beyond our family. And I stands for invested in ourselves. And so for the purposes of this conversation, I'd like to shift to, what is the vision? I can hear the inspiration and hopefulness in your voice. What is the vision for what you think is possible? And what are the ways in which you would like to see us invest in your work and the work of Mothers Against Police Brutality to move us closer to that vision?
Well, the vision for me is thriving and vibrant communities for everyone. We should all have the ability to have families and have communities and all the different ways that looks within our worlds, across the gender spectrum, across the cultural spectrum, across the religious spectrum. We should be able to have access to education, clean water, housing, parks and recreation, jobs. And the way that I believe we get there is by radically shifting the way we prioritize things within our cities and how we invest. And that's in our cities, but then also in our country. When we look at our military spending, it far outweighs the amount of money that we spend on healthcare or social safety nets. And so, especially mothers, I believe that we have so much power that we don't tap into. And that was part of why we named the organization Mothers Against Police Brutality, because mothers have this power to not only chart the direction of our families, but chart the direction of our communities and our world. You know, I remember I met a woman once who said, which it's a phrase I've always loved, she said, you know, as women, we make up half the world's population and we birth the other half. So we're the world, you know? And so recognizing and stepping into that power of demanding the types of communities that honor all of us. So, and what that looks like on a really practical level is recognizing that sameness isn't what we're moving towards, it's leaning into differences. So recognizing that the way my family looks, lives, and operates may be different than the way your family looks, lives, and operates, but we should both have enough space to breathe and thrive and really think from a place of abundance, that there is enough for all of us to thrive within this world. And also taking that personal responsibility and recognizing that we are responsible to each other. You know, I think it was something, it really didn't hit me until I had my own son. It wasn't enough for me to create an environment that was comfortable and safe for him and, you know, and pour everything into him without thinking about all of his other peers. Because at some point I won't be here. And if I only care about my child and his well-being, who will be his community? How can he really thrive in this world if everything around him is failing? Yeah. Even if not only out of love for your own child, you have to think beyond your own family base. And so that is the vision. And then in the way, how do you support this work? There are so many avenues, and I don't like to be really direct in the way that people should engage, because I believe we all have our own source of magic. And so it's about discovering what that is, and then utilizing that to make the world better. And so, you know, if you are somebody who has a voice and the expertise and ability to create a podcast, then use that platform to be part of the movement and to further the movement. If you're a dancer, then use that platform and your ability to move your body for the betterment of the movement. And so whatever it is, whatever your magic is, are you using that for the betterment of people? Are you recognizing the anti-Blackness that may live within you or your family or your community, and are you challenging that, and are you using your magic and your resources to eliminate that in this world? So there are so many ways, but I mean, if that's too ephemeral, then I would say you can always go on our website, which is www.mothersagainstpolicebrutality.com and .org. Like our Facebook page, follow us on Facebook. You can donate. You can view our policy platform and advocate for those things in your city. You can contact us and get engaged in the way that best suits you. But I feel like there is nothing too small that you can do. And even if, finding a local organization and, stuffing envelopes or providing food or, providing any type of resource, time or energy to the cause, it's something and it's needed. Just showing up and doing it. There's just, the only thing that is not good is doing nothing. Everything else is, I believe, pushing us towards a better world.
Yeah. And, so the second episode in this series of 3 for the Women Podcasters in Solidarity Initiative was with author Kate Schatz. You might know she writes these books, Rad Women A to Z, which is also a great resource in terms of expanding, in terms of our children's understanding of the role of women in our country and in the world. Kate's also an activist. And one of the things she said is, the same thing, that like activism looks different ways for different people, and everybody's starting in a different place. And the important thing is that you start and that you move. And that can look very different for different people. I'll put a link in the show for that episode as well.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think also recognizing that for every problem that exists, there are people who have been thinking about a solution. Mm-hmm. And so seeking those folks out, so if you recognize this is a problem, or that, this is not right, there's something that I want to change around this, seek out the folks around you or, nationally, internationally, who have been trying to work towards a solution. And if that solution is something you can get down with, help make it better. Yes. If not, then pivot and find something else. But recognizing there are people who are working on everything. And so how can you reinforce what's already happening or adding to it or making it better? And so as it pertains to police brutality, we have a policy platform that is local, statewide, and federal that are changes that we would like to see, that we would always embrace more hands and minds and hearts and resources to helping us achieve those things. But I think also recognizing that, knowing that 3 people on average are killed every single day in this country, that there is police brutality. There are instances of police brutality in your community. Mm-hmm. Are you aware of that? Or do you know 5 victims' names within your city? And I'm saying beyond Freddie Gray and Sandra Bland, who are the people in your city? Who are the families in your city who have experienced this pain and trauma? And how are they being supported, and what are the ways that they can be supported better?
Yes. Well, so I'm going to bookmark that for just a moment. You started to touch on the last guidepost, which is C, and it stands for connected, because you're talking about finding community among people who have been already working on these issues and may have some answers. Also, really focusing on our own local communities. I want to ask you about one other thing that struck me when I was doing some research about you before our conversation today, around the relationship between police officers and the families and the people who are so often at the other end of police brutality. And you said something like, for a long time, you were really anti-police officer, and that your thinking about that shifted, and that you've even had communication with the officer who killed your father. There's also,
Yes.
just, I think, so much division right now. I love your thoughts around how do you start to build connection and community among police officers and the communities that they serve, and how can we be a part of helping to bridge that?
Well, I think the article that you're referring to is one in which I described when I became pregnant with my son, a lot of emotion experience, and speaking to a therapist, she really encouraged me to reach out and try to have a conversation with the officers who killed my father. Because, and this is important to understand, that less than 1% of all fatal killings by police officers are ever prosecuted. Means that rarely do they ever make it to trial.
Wow.
And then beyond that are ever found guilty. Even less than 1% are ever found guilty of a crime. And part of that is because legislation all the way up to the Supreme Court has given tremendous latitude to police officers. And so the officers who killed my father are still on the police force. They still work for the Dallas Police Department today. And regardless of whether, one thinks killing my father was justified or not justified, those officers put our whole family in danger, in the sense that if we had not ducked down, we all could have been killed. We were standing right behind my father. So there is a better way than that. But to your point, or to your question rather, so in the moment when I was speaking to this counselor and she had encouraged me to reach out to these officers, I did, and one of them met with me. And it was very difficult conversation. One officer met with me, the other never responded. And we met for 10 to 15 minutes, and it was a very difficult conversation for me. But in that conversation, I realized the pain and the trauma that he was carrying as well. The way he thought about the incident and what happened and the roles that we all played in it was very different than the way I thought about it. But I recognized, I had compassion in that moment to see, here is somebody whose life was also changed by this incident. The way he thinks about in his mind, he felt like he was a hero who had saved me and my family from the monster that was my father, which is not true and not accurate. But I believe that he probably needed that in order to function within himself. That was the story he needed. That's not my reality. And I told him that, I said, my father was not the monster in our lives. My father was a business owner. He owned a landscaping business. And anybody who's ever cared for or tended a plant knows how patient and tender and loving you have to be in order to grow things in this world. And that is who he was. He was a loving person to people, to plants, to animals. He was brilliant. He spoke 5 languages. He was an amazing and loving man. And that's not who, for this officer, he felt like this man was a monster and he had, saved this family. And he also said to me, he was angry with my father because when he joined the police force, he joined because he wanted to help and protect people, and he never wanted to kill anyone. And he felt like my father took that away from him. And again, I had to tell him, my father didn't take that away from you. You chose to shoot that gun, that was your choice. And so, despite, as I said, how difficult that conversation was and how frustrating it was for me in so many aspects, I also had compassion for him because I recognized, even though I didn't agree with the way he thought about things, the narrative that he was holding on to, I recognized he was grappling with trying to make sense of this trauma as well.
Yeah.
And, it gave me great peace too, because one of the reasons I think I had always avoided confronting the officers was because I felt like, what if when I talked to them, they didn't even remember what happened. They didn't even remember that it had happened. Like, it was such an insignificant moment to them. And here it changed the whole course of my life, and it shaped every aspect of my life. And so there was some peace that came in knowing that turmoil and wrestling with the trauma that happened that evening was heavy on his heart. And it opened my eyes to recognizing that I think so often we talk about the pain and devastation that it causes for the families of the victims, which is absolutely true. But it also creates pain and trauma for the families of these police officers as well, because they have to live with that officer. Their family has to live with them as well. Their children have to wrestle with however that person is able to or not able to cope with the trauma that comes with taking someone's life. So it is closer to all of our lives than we can even imagine, and it's not healthy for anyone. And so that's really where my compassion came in. And in terms of building a bridge between police officers and communities, I don't think that that's what we need to do, in the sense that what we need to focus on is understanding that the police department is an institution, and there's not a draft to join the police force. It is a choice to become a police officer. It is a profession, and we need to require accountability and transparency within our police department. And if it is too difficult of a task for individuals to live up to those expectations and those guidelines, then that is not the right profession for them. And we have high expectations for many different professions within society. We do not give pilots the leeway to say, well, they're making split-second decisions, so we need to have more compassion when they get it wrong. We expect perfection from pilots. And pilots have continuous and ongoing training. And if they are not at 100%, they're put on probation until they are. Because we do not allow for pilots to, act in any way that they can. And, if the plane goes down, they tried their best. Maybe they feared for their life. I mean, that's absurd. We don't allow that for them. We expect more from our beauticians and our estheticians than we do from police officers. And so what I would challenge us to think about is, instead of thinking of bridging gaps between individual police officers and individuals within communities, we take a more systemic approach and talk about the policies and procedures that create safer environments within our communities. Because it's not about individual police officers being good or bad. That's not the issue. And there are a lot of people, I'm sure, who join the police department with good intentions and are good people. And that's not the issue. That's not the problem. It's the institution of policing that we need to change.
So I really appreciate this. And that's part of why I'm so glad that we're shining a light on Mothers Against Police Brutality, because of your commitment to doing the systemic work and to really looking at policy change. When this episode comes out on Giving Tuesday, I'm going to be making a contribution to your organization and your work, and inviting people who are listening now to do the same. What are one or two things that we can know when we make that investment we will be helping to make possible?
Wow, that's a really great question. One thing that you will be able to pride about in investing in Mothers Against Police Brutality is knowing that you are providing resources to people who are closest to the problem. I believe that people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution.
Yeah.
And so by providing resources to folks in Mothers Against Police Brutality who are directly impacted, you are affording us the opportunity to create policy changes and advocate for policy changes that people who have not had our experiences wouldn't even know to ask. For example, when your loved one is killed by a police officer, not only are you in the midst of mourning their loss, you have to clean their blood from the car or the house or wherever the incident took place. And in my circumstance, it was in our home. There's no cleanup crew. The police department doesn't do that. You have to take the bullet holes out of the walls, wash the floor of your loved one's blood in the midst of going through the legal battle and planning a funeral. So that's a really intimate experience that unless you have been through it, you wouldn't know. So the policy changes that we advocate for come from our lived experiences. And so you are supporting that work. You're supporting an organization founded by and run by women of color, and particularly Black women. And you're also affording us the opportunity to build a network of families who, for many, activism looks like getting out of bed in the morning and being able to function and moving past that point of pain and trauma into a place of power and feeling like I can take my story, I can take my experiences, and I can transform that pain into power and create change that is the legacy of our loved ones. You know, that is the way our families can be honored and their lives can live on.
So powerful. We're getting to the last few minutes of this conversation I'm so grateful for, Sara. Thank you so much for sharing all of this wisdom and all of your lived experience. At the end, there are two things. One is for you to give a specific challenge to me coming from this conversation. Yeah, I feel like you've threaded challenges all the way throughout, but if there's one thing that's really calling to you from where we've landed now in the conversation, for me and anybody else who's listening, I'd love to hear that. And then we'll move to just chance to both acknowledge the power of this conversation and what we're leaving the conversation with. So first, what would be your challenge for me and anybody else who's listening?
I challenge you and your listeners to have a courageous conversation over the holidays with family members it may be difficult to have it with. And talking about policing in this country and learning about how your family and the people who are in your intimate circle think about police and where they think those ideas come from. Why do they feel the way that they do about police? And bringing the stories that I've shared today or doing some research about stories within your own personal community of another view of policing into that conversation and using your proximity to those loved ones as a place to have that conversation, because they might not be as open to hearing my story or hearing these things from me as they would from you. Yeah. And so having those conversations with your family members over the holidays is a challenge that I put to you and to your listeners.
Okay, thank you. I feel challenged by that. So I think that's a good one. It's an important stretch. And then, absolutely, what we shared before in terms of, I will continue to look locally. That's a commitment I made to Nicole. And I'm looking forward to downloading your policy recommendations and reaching out to my local police department and, getting informed about where there's need for improvement in my own city. And then I will be making a contribution for your work and encouraging other people to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I hope that we'll stay connected, and I will continue to share your work with my community. I want to move into our final acknowledgments and just say that, you mentioned this idea of, the legacy of your loved ones who you've lost. And I just felt so much just the wisdom and the power and the hopefulness, even in all the trauma that you've moved through, that is so clearly going to push this work forward. And it just makes me feel more hopeful that change is possible, knowing that somebody like you is able to be a leader that we can support. So I'm in awe of your courage and your resilience. And we'll be going back and listening to this conversation again and again, to pulling out the things I know I can really learn from as I move into doing more of this work. What's coming up for you? What are your biggest takeaways?
My biggest takeaway from our conversation is that there is always an opening for folks to get involved and get engaged and get connected and to be open to that. I think for me, a lot of the times this work can feel very lonely, can feel very isolated, can be very frustrating. But knowing that regardless of how and when people come into an understanding of the need for change, to always be open and embracing to that, because I think that's the only way that we will survive. I believe we are all here with purpose. It's very difficult to make it into this world. I mean, like the probability of your parents meeting or however you were conceived, right? Like conception within itself is not always easy. And then to make it 9 months or however long it took to get you prepared to come into this world and whatever your birth story was, and then however long it took you to like grow into whatever stage we may be in, all of that. And, and then for all the histories that had to come together for us to even be here in this moment, I think that there is infinite purpose and power in that. And so recognizing that, I think that we all hold value and all hold a piece to making this world better for ourselves, for our children, for the future generations, 7 generations out. And so what I take from this is that people are always going to come at their own pace and in their own time, and to have open arms and an open heart to embracing that.
Such a beautiful message. So I feel in this moment like I want to end almost with a prayer and a call to action. And so I'm going to start with my first thought of a wish for all of us, and then I'd invite you to add on. May we start and move in responsibility for this work from wherever we are.
And may we have the courage to go to those difficult and painful places in our present, in our past, so that we can create a freer future.
May we each find that magic that you talked about within to make a difference.
May we learn to celebrate our differences, respect our differences, and find mutual joy.
And may we all take a moment right now to take action. And for me, that will be making a contribution to your work. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. If you're feeling called, as I am, to make a contribution to Mothers Against Police Brutality, please visit mothersquest.com for links for where you can contribute. Or if you're tuning in on Giving Tuesday, find the Mother's Quest page on Facebook and click there to be part of the Giving Tuesday fundraising goal. Until next time, I want to leave you with some words to light the way on your quest. Seize the day, love your people, honor your gift.